Welcome back for another episode of Scon Biology. I'm Two-Tone Miles. As usual, we're rebroadcasting this episode at sconbiology.wordpress.com. And if you got questions or just want to talk shop, send me an email at sconbiology.gmail.com. Today's episode features a couple organ ska acts that I'm really enthusiastic about. You just heard a clip of Please Stop Your Lying, which is a cover of an Errol Dunkley song, and is performed by The Sentiments. Now, I mentioned The Sentiments back on my Just Ska episode, and they sound absolutely amazing live. If you have the opportunity to go hear them live, do it. So check out The Sentiments on Facebook. Also check out Simmer Down Productions. You should buy the CD too. Believe me, that's money well spent. And later on, we're going to have some Necktie Killer. This is Episode 5, Cells, Cell Theory, and Organelles. Now, I mentioned organelles briefly in Episode 4 when we talked about DNA and talking about how DNA is encased in an organelle called the nucleus. So let's explore this concept in greater detail. Let's start off with what a cell is. A cell is the fundamental unit of life. It is capable of all the biological process we mentioned in Episode 2. Life can be as simple as a single cell, a single-celled organism. A drop of pond water may contain small single-celled organisms such as protozoa or amoeba. Yeast for making bread and beer exists as a single cell. And I got a special episode based around yeast, which I hope to get out the door pretty soon. Cells can also be organized into complex groups that define tissues and organs. Your brain is made of brain cells, your muscles made of muscle cells, your blood made of blood cells, etc., etc. As we discussed in Episode 4, proteins and the DNA and RNA signals to make certain proteins help to define the role a cell will play in the context of a multicellular organism. Now, cells are very small, the vast majority of which cannot be seen with the unaided eye. We need microscopes to see cells. In fact, I'd like to cover 4 landmark discoveries that inform what we consider modern cell theory. The term cell was originally coined in 1665 by a scientist named Robert Hooke. Now, looking at a section of cork, Hooke was able to see small structures that looked like tiny compartments or rooms, which he termed cells. Now, this discovery was followed upon much later, almost 150 years later to be exact, by several discoveries. Now, Matthias Jacob Schleiden discovered that all plants were made of cells. And Theodor Schwann made a similar conclusion about animals, that animals were made up of cells. And Rudolf Virchow made a rather famous statement in the Old Latin, omnis cellula a cellula. Every living cell comes from another living cell. So cells don't violate the second law of thermodynamics. And for those who know Latin, non carborundum illegitimi, for those of you who will get that reference. So Hooke, Schleiden, Schwann, and Virchow, these are the fathers of cell theory. Okay, so I mentioned organelles last time, but let's do a quick recap. Much like the organs of your body each have their own unique function, each cell is filled with small microorgans that we call organelles, and each organelle has a unique function. Lipid bilayers, you remember those? Good, because each organelle has a lipid bilayer membrane that help define where the organelle begins and ends. Okay, so we're going to take a quick tour of the cell and the organelles and what these organelles do. Now, much like our discussion of the chemistry of life was themed around the discussion of a balanced diet, we're going to use an extended metaphor to describe the cell. we're going to compare the cell to a factory. But first, we're going to need a visual aid. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through what's going on in that picture. But seriously, if anyone can tell me how to do visual aids without significantly increasing my production time, I'm all ears. I'm considering building a green screen to do this. Again, if you know how to do it, tell me. I need those kind of tips. So, you may also want to open up another browser image so you can constantly refer back to this image of the cell. So, like I said before, the nucleus, which houses the genome, all that DNA, can be thought of as both blueprints and the production foreman. It's in the nucleus that the DNA responds to signals from the environment and says, okay, we need to make this protein. And so those signals get sent out in the form of work orders. These work orders are called mRNA, and we'll expand upon this when we talk a bit more about DNA and RNA in greater detail. So we've got our work order to make a certain protein. Where does this work order go? So it exits the nucleus and into a network of basically cellular hallways called the endoplasmic reticulum, also abbreviated ER. And it's a big fancy word for where the proteins actually get made and folded. Now, lining the endoplasmic reticulum are small structures called ribosomes. The ribosomes can be thought of as the workers, or if you're in a high-tech production situation, your production robots. The ribosomes take that mRNA work order and decode it to start making the proper protein. Now, the mRNA work order has codons, which are sequences of 3 nitrogen bases long. You can think of them like their telephone area codes. Now, each codon tells the ribosome to do a certain thing, whether it's to start making a protein, bring in a particular amino acid, or stop building the protein. The mRNA signal is translated into the protein primary structure. And this process is literally called translation. Remember that because it's going to come in handy later on. Now, when the ribosomes line the ER, it can give it a studded or rough appearance. And this is what we call the rough ER. Other parts of the ER don't have ribosomes, and that gives them a smooth appearance, and this we call smooth ER. The ribosomes take care of protein assembly in the rough ER, while advanced protein folding, your secondary, tertiary, quaternary structure, that occurs in the smooth ER. So now we have our folded protein. So that means we're done, right? No. Factories don't just make parts and products. They also package and ship them. So where does this happen? There's an organelle called the Golgi apparatus. It's also called the Golgi body. And it's responsible for protein sorting, sorting the protein into various packets to go certain places. And they can also do some protein modification to modify the folding. So you can think of the Golgi apparatus as both sorting and packaging, as well as some end product quality control to make sure the protein is properly folded. Now, proteins, as well as lipids and carbohydrates, can be packed into small containers, which we call vesicles. Now, some of these vesicles may be shipped outside the cell in a process called exocytosis. Think of it as exporting exocytosis. We'll cover this a bit more in the next episode. Cells can also take in vesicles like a shipment, and this is called endocytosis, kind of the equivalent of importing inventory. Or a cell can just keep a vesicle around until it's needed, basically as a food source, like keeping part of your product available as on-hand inventory. Large vesicles can be referred to as vacuoles. So that's just the same thing as a vesicle, but just a much bigger storage container. So that covers the ordering, building, and shipping and receiving components of our factory. So we're done now, right? Nope. We still have more organelles to cover, but don't worry, we're getting towards the end here. So much like the factory has steel I-beams, mezzanine layers, and load-bearing walls that give the factory its structure, you have various proteins that give the shell a shape or a skeleton. This protein network we call a cytoskeleton. It's the skeleton of the cell. It gives the cell a certain shape. Your factory may also need hot water, electricity, or to burn fuel to power the production machinery. And that's the job of the mitochondria. They produce the chemical energy to power the cell. Think of mitochondria as like a mini power plant to power the cell. Now maybe you work for a company that's trying to go green or use renewable energy. A company that, say, installed solar panels on its roofs. In that case, our metaphorical factory would be a plant cell in this example. Plants have organelles called chloroplasts, which use the sun's rays to make their own renewable energy. Lastly, you have the outermost wall of the factory. This could be your fence line, your property line, or basically the walls that define the outer edge of your factory. This, in our analogy, is the cell membrane. It's a lipid bilayer that basically says, okay, we end here. Beyond that, that may be other cells if you're a multi-celled organism, or the environment if you're a single-celled organism. But it basically says, here's where we are, out there is where we are not. It's the border that defines where a cell begins and ends. Now plants, they have an extra layer of protection called the cell wall. See, animals need to have cells that can move around and slide against each other because we move around a lot. They need to be flexible. Plants are different. Plants don't have all these tendons and muscles constantly moving them around. They need to be a bit more rigid, and that's what the cell wall does. It holds the structure a bit more rigid. The cell wall is made of cellulose, which we said in episode 3 is the same as dietary fiber. Alright, so that brings us to the end of our discussion of the cell and the organelles. Now, as we get into metabolism and cell division, we're going to need to refer to the organelles to give you an idea of where things take place inside the cell. But we're going to cover that in future lectures. Now, playing us out today is Necktie Killer with the song, What Do You Expect? I saw these guys back in 2010, and I need to make it a point to see them again. They do great live versions of ska classics Beer and Time Bomb, and they also have some great original material. They gave out a free demo CD at the show, which I thought was a really nice touch, and their songs have been a regular mainstay on my MP3 player. In fact, if you go to necktiekiller.com, you can pick up some free MP3s. So yeah, good music for free, pretty awesome. And I've been informed that they're working on new material, and I'm really excited about that. So here's some Necktie Killer for you.
Trick like you come smacking me in the face. You keep me on the back burner just in case.